Welcome to the Significance Podcast. Yes, another episode where we are talking about the human need that makes the world go round. It's based, in fact, on a book that I've had the honor, I'm Dan Raviv, the honor of co-authoring with one of, frankly, the world's top experts on human motivation, Dr. Arie Kruglanski. And together, this book by Kruglanski and Raviv is called The Quest for Significance, Harnessing the Need that makes the world go round. And I'm happy to introduce those of you who don't know Arya Kruglanski. I know we have a guest on this episode of the podcast, but Arya, for anyone who's not familiar with the basic concept, just help me again with the brief definition as to why significance matters so much.
Yes, the quest for significance is the quest to have social worth, to matter, to be somebody, to have status, prestige, be evaluated positively by others. And what is important about this motivation is that it really makes the world turn around. It affects our daily lives. The good news are when somebody likes us, somebody appreciates us, somebody accepts our offer, gives us a positive answer. The bad news is if we are rejected, refused, ghosted, ignored. But not only our everyday lives are totally governed, our moods, the way we feel about ourselves on a day-to-day basis, but also the way politics go, the kind of reasons why people launch wars. Putin invading Ukraine is because of his quest for significance, to make Russia big again, to make Putin great again. That's also the reason why Hitler invaded Europe during Second World War. That's why revolutions are launched, social movements are launched by groups of people that feel discriminated against, be it women, be it African Americans, be it LGBTQ, be it whoever. They get together, and to defend their significance, they strive to change the world, to change society. That's why this motivation is so important for each one of us individually, but also for the world at large.
And in our book, Arya, The Quest for Significance, we not only give the history, in effect, a history of humankind from the cave dwellers through the Middle Ages to our lives as they're led today, but also we dare to give a little bit of advice how you can use this knowledge, improve your relationships in your private life, your professional life, and also think about how the quest for significance has driven humans to do all kinds of things. And I know that with our guest, Sophia Moskalenko, we will be touching on several of these same themes. And I'm intrigued that some of it will be childhood and how children discover significance. Arya, why don't you pick up?
Yes, well, Dr. Sophia Moskalenko, is one of the world's greatest authorities on radicalization and terrorism, but also on issues of narratives and how people acquire significance. Because, we know that the quest for significance is so important, but the cardinal, essential question is how people know what to do in order to be significant. How we all somehow intuitively know that to be rich, to be famous, to be courageous gives us significance. And Dr. Moskalenko's work on narrative and socialization explains why and how does it happen. So I would like to introduce this great expert on socialization as well as on terrorism, and pose to her the question is, how do people know what to do in order to be significant?
Yes, thank you for that very generous and not entirely deserved praise. I want to go back to my own discovery of the quest for significance theory. I'm very lucky to have been in Arya's orbit for almost 20 years now, through our work on terrorism being adjacent and for a while being together at the START Center at the University of Maryland. And so when this theory of the quest for significance came out, it was clear to anybody with eyes and ears that it had some fundamental truth, which is what we psychologists strive for. But for me personally, there was something missing. And specifically, okay, I am ready to agree that people do horrible things like engage in political violence and terrorism and atrocities in order to boost their significance. But the same theory predicts that boosting significance can come from diametrically opposed behaviors, humanitarianism and almost sainthood of people like Mother Teresa or Gandhi. And a theory that doesn't quite help us to understand how the same motivation can lead to these completely different behaviors and consequences needs something else, right? So it was some years of me sitting with this discomfort during which I had three of my own children and worked on some other things that I started thinking about the role of fairy tales, the earliest narratives that we tell our children at bedtimes, you know, as stories and show them as cartoons or films or plays. And watching my own children and their friends, it became absolutely clear to me that this developmental period is when children acquire, soak up the narratives that tell them the recipes for how to get significance. And specifically, there is a time during which children develop what's called theory of mind. So when a child is really little, they believe the world literally revolves around them. So they can't understand that somebody else sees something that they themselves don't see. They're unable to take another person's perspective. And so hopefully, you know, they're loved and cherished and they feel that they are the center of the world because other people treat them with a lot of kindness and give them a lot of significance. However, at around the age of 4, all children go through these developmental milestones who are normally developing, where they realize that other people have contents of their minds that are different from their own. And very soon, they also realize that even though they may feel that they're the center of the world, other people may feel very differently about them. And so this discovery is quite traumatic. And you, as a child, you want to restore that significance that you've lost through the understanding that other people don't necessarily value you as much as you value yourself. And it just so happens that this is exactly the time in the developmental period when we start telling children, narratives that adhere to kind of a script. It's a short story. It has a main character that a child can identify with. That character has a struggle. It has to fight something, overcome something, deal with something that's difficult and unpleasant. And usually they have a happy ending. So they get what they want. They, you know, overcome whatever it is that was in their way. And sometimes instead of a happy ending, they have a moral. Okay. Like they didn't succeed, but you know, this is what you need to do in order to succeed. So it occurred to me that fairy tales are this bridge that the children need from the loss of significance that occurs as a result of theory of mind development to regaining significance. And it's interesting that there are these fairy tales that we all know about, probably, but depending on what culture, what network, as Ari would put it, these fairy tales come from, the endings or the morals are very, very different. So, for example, the story of Cinderella, that is, you know, very widely known in the Western world, it ends very differently if it's a German origin or if it's a French origin. So in the German origin, the lesser known one, maybe in America, birds or ravens pluck out the eyes of the evil stepsister and then the stepmother, and they're thrown out of their home and are made to wander streets and beg for food. A punishment for their cruelty, even as Cinderella is rewarded for her kindness, right? Whereas in the French fairy tale, it's just, you know, happy love story that ends with the marriage and like we don't care anymore about these evil women, right? And the same thing happens, for example, with the Little Red Riding Hood. So when it's a German story, it ends with the hunter discovering the wolf, cutting its belly open and releasing the grandmother and Red Riding Hood. So again, the bad guys lose, the good guys win, and there is a strong and powerful hero. It's a very German kind of story. But in the French story, there is no happy ending. Like, they end up eaten by the wolf, and that's where they stay. Yet there is a moral which says that little girls need to be really aware of wolves, especially wolves that come in disguises. So it's a story about male violence that women should be aware of and guard against, right? So very, very different cultural narratives that will probably result in people following very different paths to get significance, right? And in my work on terrorism, I've perused some documents from people who became terrorists, and it's also clear that for these people, the narratives they follow have a seed of what they later became. So this Canadian terrorist, Momin Khawaja, who's convicted and serving time in prison in Canada for plotting a mass casualty attack in London, he told his girlfriend in letters that he remembers his mother reading him stories about Muslim warriors and how they slayed all of their enemies and achieved victory through mass casualties, basically. And so the interesting thing is that these very early fairy tales that a lot of us don't think about on a day-to-day basis, I believe still have the power to guide us, especially when it comes to really uncertain times of crisis, when, really small actions have potentially huge consequences, when there's war or upheaval. We resort to the rudimentary understanding of what's good and what's evil and what we should do to achieve whatever we believe is a happy end for us. And so, for example, during when the war started in Ukraine, the big invasion in 2022, murals appeared around the world, like in Poland and other places, that depicted Zelensky as Harry Potter and Putin as Voldemort from the Harry Potter series, the evil wizard. And people everywhere started referring to the Russian invaders as orcs, which is, of course, a fairy tale monster, right? So we use these shorthands that come from our childhoods because they communicate very clearly across cultural divides, across all other layers of culture that we've put on since we were little. It drives to the heart of the problem. These people are bad. These are good. You should be on the side of the good to feel good yourself. And charismatic leaders really know this, and they use this to mobilize people. So if you think of Martin Luther King's famous speech, I have a dream, it uses a classic fairy tale formula, and I have something in the Handbook of Significance where I break it down, where it says, once upon a time, something went wrong, and now we must rise up and fix it to achieve peace and goodness for all. And what's more, it says, you are the hero we're waiting for. So it mobilizes the person to achieve this fairy tale happy ending. And of course, fairy tales can be also twisted. In fact, for example, the Brothers Grimm famous fairy tales in the run-up to World War II contained several fairy tales that we have not seen, probably because they were later taken out, that were extremely anti-Semitic. One of them was called A Jew in the Brumbles, that described this main character who was, of course, Jewish, who was like very mercenary and cunning and scheming to get people into bad situations to take advantage of them. And in the run-up to World War II, the Nazi Party really leaned on the fairy tales and popularized them and cast Hitler as the hero who saves the day. And it was so obvious that after World War II, Grimm's fairy tales were banned by the Allied forces in Germany for a few years. And then when they resurfaced, they kind of were cleaned up of all that anti-Semitism, and we know them now as Grimm's fairy tales. And propaganda often uses the same storytelling structures to justify things that they want to do. So Putin's speech that justified the invasion of Ukraine followed the same fairy tale narrative formula that Martin Luther King used. It's out there for everyone. And even terrorist radicalization and charismatic leaders use the same formula to mobilize their followers for what they call heroism and we call terrorism.
I have a
Yeah.
question, Dr. Moskalenko, and of course, hello, co-author Arie Kruglanski. You're going to definitely have part of the answer here, because I'm wondering whether that formula of leaders, charismatic leaders, elected, unelected, dictators, terrorist leaders, who are able to persuade and indoctrinate the followers, okay, by getting back down to the roots of that person's upbringing. Talk about narratives, as you write so much about, Arya Kruglanski, needs, narratives, network, in order to be the building blocks, part of that to activate our need for significance. So I'm wondering if the leader, in going back to things like fairy tales, is he, it's almost always a man, not always, is he acting like he's the only one with significance and I can bestow some of it upon you? Or is he trying to make the average follower feel you are all significant, you can all be heroes on your own? I'm not too sure sometimes about who's giving it to whom or igniting whose significance.
So I looked at several speeches that are well known, like the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King's speech, Goebbels' speech, the famous speech that to justify massive war, and Putin's speech. And in those, so I mean, not every speech is going to be as rousing and as mobilizing as every other speech. Like those stand out because they really, really made a difference, right? And in those particular examples, the formula goes, we were once doing really well, we were peaceful, didn't bother anybody, and then these horrible things happened to us because of these monsters. And we need to rise up and get, back to the good, the goodness. And we are the heroes. So it's giving the followers a recipe for how to achieve significance of their own by becoming a hero in this story that is not yet finished, that is unfolding, and they're at its center stage. They're the main character, which is, I think, why that those speeches are particularly mobilizing, right? If you think somebody else is going to do the job for you, you're not going to move, right? But if it's on you to save the day, make America great again, or Russia great again, or whatever it is, you're likely to do something.
Adoria, especially when significance is taken away or folks are convinced that some enemy took away our significance. That's especially powerful. Arya?
I want to follow up on what Dan just said, and the kind of structure you have been describing, Sophia, is particularly relevant to the kind of rousing, mobilizing for struggle narratives. But I think that you would agree with me, or maybe not, that the fairy tales also bring to people's attention other values, values of compassion, values of beauty, values of resilience. The ugly duckling idea that you've got to you really believe in yourself, or the girl with the matches, Hans Christian Andersen, the value of compassion and humanity. So it's not only the kind of struggle values that are also emphasizing the values of courage and resilience and strength and the willingness to fight, but also other values that are less militant, less aggressive, less values in general.
Absolutely. And I think, the genre of fairy tales is so diverse. If, in my home, I have this huge bookshelf that goes floor to ceiling. It's all fairy tales. Um, and for example, French fairy tales are really emphasizing clothes as a value, right? So Puss in Boots is only, as good as he is because he has the boots, right? And Cinderella, without the slipper, where would she be? So there's this whole, like, that they have another one called Donkey Skin, where it's a princess and she has these clothes made, and and a donkey skin to hide herself. Anyway, it's like there's so much about clothes. And France, of course, is the capital of fashion still to this day, hundreds of years after these fairy tales were immortalized by Charles Perrault. And anything you can think of as a value is probably emphasized by a fairy tale somewhere. So there's actually a genre of psychotherapy which is informed by the importance of early fairy tales on a person's whole life, where, you know, you're asked, what is the most important fairy tales to you, the one that you grew up with, that you went back to again and again and again? And if you do that to your friends and family, it's mind-blowing the kinds of insight you're going to get from what they tell you. And they themselves may not know it until you explain it to them. But then when you do, it's so clear that this person's really living out some of these recipes that they gravitated to when they were little. However, that being said, I think we humans are unique in our ability to appreciate and share narratives. And a gifted storyteller, you know, Steve Jobs, the inventor of Apple, he said the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. So a gifted storyteller can really transport you from whatever your personal journey is or where you are on it into the world that they construct for you. And they can convince you that there are human lizard hybrids out there who are going to take over the world if we don't stop them, that there's the cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles that took over the government and the media, and they can be convincing enough that you take up whatever route to significance they offer you. They say, you know, all is lost. There are children being sexually abused, you know, in basements, and unless you do something, you're going to allow this evil to spread and take over. And that is a very mobilizing fairy tale like message that mobilized millions of Americans. And we know it as QAnon. But if at the rudimentary level, it is a fairy tale that can move people to do all kinds of things.
Arya, I know we touched upon that in our book, some of those same conspiracy theories that Dr. Moskalenko was mentioning. And it might be just good to give us a reminder. I mean, as Dr. Moskalenko said, it's very mobilizing, but I can't help thinking that everybody's different. You know, some people are going to hear about lizards or about something nefarious happening in the basement of a restaurant in Washington, D.C., and just resist it. It doesn't work. Can you just speak to some of the individual differences, sort of the target of the propaganda? It doesn't work on everybody.
Did you ask Ari?
Well, I was
No,
wondering if Arya had a view on that. I mean, not everyone receives these myths and mobilizing messages the same. What are the differences based on?
well, people differ both as stable individual differences, and also situationally, how much significance they desire, and what kind of narratives, what kind of fairy tales they listened to in their childhood that made particular impression on them. So for some people, invoking a kind of hero paradigm may be very arousing and very motivating. For other people, that is not very motivating, and they have other, the idea of honesty, the idea of compassion, the idea of siding with the underdog, the idea of persistence. These may speak more to them. For example, my own personal favorite fairy tale is one that was told by Selma Lagerlöf, the Swedish Nobel Prize winner, in her book, The Wonderful Travels of Nils Holgersson. And this is a story about a Swedish hero that was sent to fight giants. And he came to this place, and it was a very barren place with nothing growing and on mountains. And then he was very tired, and he knocked on the door and to look for lodging. And this woman opened the door to him, and he said, "Can I spend the night here?" And she said, "Well, only if you help me with my house chores." And he said, "Sure, I can do that." And she asked him to mop the floor. And he started mopping the floor, and the water kept flowing and flowing, and he started digging canals in the floor in order to divert the water, and he spent the whole night working on it and changing the shape of the floor. And in the morning he said, I have really no business fighting the giants. If I cannot even help the woman with her housework, I better go back home. And he opened the door, and he saw that he, by dint of his work, changed the face of the terrain, and now it was beautiful rivers flowing and things growing, and that's what he accomplished. So it's kind of the idea of struggle and the value of struggle that I took away from it, and it's very inspiring to me to this day.
Well, Dr.
I think it
Moskalenko,
also,
before we let you go back to your teaching at Georgia State University and all those many places where you're lecturing and writing about, right, so much of it actually does touch on how human beings want their lives to matter, and there's good and bad. I know you're doing a lot of work on the bad, shall we say, radicalism and terrorism, but I think people have to realize it comes from something innate that everybody has, and it can be directed in various directions. Would you agree?
I think good and bad doesn't exist without some sort of subjective judgment. And for us, terrorism is bad. But for people who support the terrorists, they're heroes. They're absolutely good. So within their network, this is clearly the path to significance that's recognized and celebrated. For us, it's bad, right? For them, it's good. So all these narratives and paths make sense to people who engage. People, in Russia, people support the invasion of Ukraine because they think that's good. In Ukraine, people support fighting off Russia because they think that's good. So our framework that started, the scaffolding of it begins when we're very little, but it determines then how we perceive the world, what we call good or bad, and what we do about things that we feel are bad.
What a fantastic finish. My partner in the book, The Quest for Significance, Harnessing the Need That Makes the World Go Round, from Routledge, by the way. Arie, any final words? Maybe you can tie all this together.
Well, no, I think that Dr. Moskalenko, Sophia's work on narratives is extremely important because it tells us how it all started in the very impressionable time of our childhood. We are inculcated with values, and we are doing it not through some boring lectures from teachers and other educators, but through very enticing stories with which we identify with the protagonists. We want to be like them. These are role models, and they are kind of internalized, become part of who we are. And that all starts through these narratives conveyed by fairy tales. So this is really an important discovery of how people know what to do in order to be significant. And this all happens through fairy tales and the narratives that they convey.
And in our daily lives. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Sophia Moskalenko. Thanks so much. Those of you who listen to and watch podcasts, right? Look at YouTube and Spotify, all your podcast platforms for listening to the Significance podcast. Arie Kruglanski, it's been an honor writing The Quest for Significance and even talking about it with you. I'm Dan Raviv. Thank you all very much.